alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to How I Write, our series of interviews with writers. And today we have a very special treat. We are speaking with K.Eltinaé, who, weirdly enough, we live in the same area. We have not connected in real life yet, IRL. So here we are over Zoom. Alhamdulillah, I'm really, really happy to welcome you. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you, Medina, for it's a real honor and pleasure to be here with Muslim Writer Salon and to be able to share space with you today.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, so I'm going to read very briefly Kay's bio. This is from his debut collection of poetry, which is called The Moral Judgement of Butterflies, which is incredible. You guys have to look it up, believe me. It will be well worth your while. K.Eltinaé is a Sudanese poet of Nubian descent, raised internationally as a third culture kid. His work has been translated into Arabic, Greek, Farsi, and Spanish, and has appeared in world literature today. The Ordinary Chaos of Being Human, Many Muslim Worlds, which is an anthology that came out with Penguin. The African American Review, About Place Journal, Muftah, and others, among others. He is the first place poetry winner of Muftah's creative writing competition at home in the world, the winner of the Memorial Reza Abdur Poetry Prize 2021 from Tofu Ink Press, and the co-winner of the 2019 Dignity Not Detention Prize from Poetry International. He currently resides in Granada, Spain. That doesn't mention the fact that this collection of poetry also won an award, a very prestigious award, which was the International Beverley Prize. And the praise for this book is just off the scale. I just want to mention one or two little things, hopefully not embarrass you too much. You have praise from Ilya Kaminsky, Ladan Osman, and the judge's citation from the International Beverley Prize for Literature, which is the judge was Dr. Todd Swift. He says, "This poetry collection was nearly faultless in its imaginative reach, creative flair, and astonishing versatility. Reading it felt like being in the presence of an already great vision, a writer, in this case poet, who knew precisely the measure of what had to be said and why, but who never forgot that writing must be moving before it can be persuasive. I believe this collection will be one of the important books of this decade, and I'm proud to have been able to select it." So first off, congratulations. That is phenomenal. What an achievement, mashallah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a real honor to receive that award. I had been writing the book for 5 years, and there's like a bit of a backstory behind the book, actually, which not a lot of people know. Obviously, when you pick up a book, you don't know about the author's life usually. But yeah, the book is about displacement, is about this idea of tarhal, of moving from place to place, which has kind of been my motive like my entire life. And during the time that I wrote this book, actually, this book for me was like a lifeline because I had some issues with the Sudanese government, and I had my passport revoked for about 8 years. And so I wrote my book during that time period, and feeling the very scary reality of being stateless in Spain. And so the book actually came from that. And so I was really fortunate during that time, like right before it happened, that I met with a really close friend who was also living in the city and was actually visiting this week, who's Puerto Rican and from New York. And she kind of pushed me. We met together for a tapa, as we do in Granada. And she said, she was like, "Oh, you should get your work out there, start sending your work out." I had like this big pile of poems, like kind of compiled in this little makeshift thing. And she was like, "You need to." So I started working on the project, and originally I had a different title. It was called Tarhal. And over time, some of the poems in Tarhal were shortlisted for the Brunel Poetry Prize, for African Poetry Prize. And at that time, it was called Tarhal. And then the poem started developing. And then one summer, I kind of sat with the book and decided that there were like 10 poems that I wasn't happy with. And I wasn't happy with them because I felt like I wasn't being clear enough in what I wanted to say. And so I kind of scrapped them from the original manuscript, and I decided to write 10 last poems. And it's really interesting how those poems came about, because in a way they really set the tone for the entire collection. And I felt like some of those poems, I can mention some of the titles, are Breathing Exercises, Watermark, I think was the first one. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of a backstory to the book. I don't know. I'm just
Oh,
throwing out.
and so was it in that process that you changed the title in the end?
The title originally, when I moved to Spain, I was writing a memoir and I got to chapter 6 and I was like, I'm still alive, so I don't really know what I'm doing. So I gave up on writing the memoir, and I actually just started like cutting it up, and part of it is what a segment of it is what I published in the Ordinary Chaos of Being Human, and in other places too. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's really fascinating as well. I mean, one of the things that we really want to do as part of the Muslim Writers Salon, and especially through these interviews, is kind of demystify the writing and the publishing process. So would you like to tell us a little bit about what got you into writing poetry in the first place and writing in general? Because obviously you're not only a poet.
Um, to be honest, like I've always loved books. I've like been obsessed with books from a very young age, and I really like Sufi poetry, like and especially Persian literature, Greek literature, and so I grew up with a lot of. I love the way that like poems are very short and compact, and they feel like a snapshot. And I love photography as well, so I feel like all of those three things kind of blend in together into my love of reading. I've always been like a voracious reader, to the point that like I got myself in trouble growing up. At one point, I had all my books taken away from me and my library card. Also, my parents like were really upset about me asking a bunch of friends to borrow books from me. I had like 25 books in my house. My parents were like, "You're stealing books from the library," and I have also a lot of trauma with books, like a lot of funny stories with books as well. And so yeah, I've always been a voracious reader, and I just started writing and doodling when I was a kid, and actually didn't even start on paper. It started like in the air. I had this habit when I was a kid to like write things in the air, and my dad used to be like, "Stop doing that. People are gonna think you're crazy." And yeah, I just developed into stuff. In high school, I won a few awards. I got to go on this really interesting like trip called Creative Connections, where a bunch of different artists and different, I went for performing arts as well, but I went for writing, for creative writing. And it was in like Overwiesel in Germany, where like we got to like live in the castle and like kind of work on different things and then do a collective kind of performance at the end. And so I've always, music and writing have always been a really central part of my life, like from a very young age. Yeah.
Wow, I can really relate to that as well. And yeah, because I make music as well. And writing songs and writing poems just feels so naturally resonant one with the other, like you can write a poem and turn it into a song. You can, yeah, when you write a song as a song, just looking at the lyrics, you have a poem as well. It's though they work differently, there's an interesting kind of synergy between them. I remember you saying you had an interesting anecdote, talking about your interesting anecdotes with books and writers. You had a run-in with Leila Aboulela, is that right?
Yeah, with Leila Aboulela. So I met Leila Aboulela many moons ago at the University of Khartoum, and at that point, um, they were organizing her visit. She would come to the university, and I had the opportunity of meeting her. But actually, I was introduced to her books by a family friend who had, at that moment, I think he had Colored Lights, and I was fascinated by her writing. It was maybe the second thing I read after the first thing I'd read that absolutely blew my mind was The God of Small Things by Anecdote Roy, and I just loved how she was kind of, in a way, translating her culture, but it was in English, and you could just, everything was so vivid and real, and it actually to this day really influences a lot of the ways that like when I'm writing poems, like for example, in my book, there's a poem called Kuhul, and Kuhul is written in English, but the way, the style, everything is completely Arabic. And so this is the thing that I try to do with my work. Like I try to, it's like writing something Arabic, but in English, writing something that is, in English, but is Greek or Turkish or, any of the other languages. And like sometimes also this idea that English is not enough always. And I find that, especially with Arabic, and like I have another poem in the collection called Huzun, which is about my aunt who passed away, and this concept of sadness and how it's so layered, you know, and that. But yeah, Leila's book was like one of my favorite books, and every time I'd go visit this family, this relative, I would like sit, you know, in the corner and just read her book over and over again. And each time, Ammi, his name was Malia, he would be like, "Do you want to borrow the book?" And my dad would be like, "No, he doesn't get any books. Like he already has enough books. He has an issue with books." Like so, my dad just would kind of just be like, "No, he can read it while he's here," you know. So I would just read this book, and so finally, I think my dad got sick of me reading the book, and he borrowed it and decided to make photocopies of the book. And I don't know what happened with the photocopying machine, but the books he like photocopied them in a really strange size, like coffee table, like huge. And he got them bound and like it's really hard. One was orange, one was green, and at the time that Leila Aboulela came to visit, everybody was getting autographs, and so I was like, hey, I might as well get her to sign these books. And so like I approached her and I was like, I would really love it if you sign these books. And she just looked completely like taken aback. She was like, I'm not familiar with these editions, you know? And obviously she, you know, they were photocopied and they looked really strange because they were like storybooks, like really big in size. And she kind of gave a little chuckle. And years later, it was really actually quite funny to uh, be in the same, published in the same anthology, which is the same as you in The Ordinary Chaos of Being Human, and reading her piece and her talking about being in Khartoum and this experience of coming across these books that were like completely huge, and it was quite nice. Of her, Leila Aboulela is also a huge inspiration. Her writing is beautiful and so lyrical, and just there's something about it, just stays with you. It's still some of my favorite literature to revisit.
Yeah, she's one of our favorite writers as well. And Ambati, who's with us, interviewed her she was our first book club choice for the Muslim Writers Salon with River Spirit. So we've kind of like been connected to Sudanese writers since the first, which is not surprising since it is a nation that seems to have birthed so many incredible artists and literary people. I wanted to ask you how it is for you, especially as you describe yourself as a third culture kid and having, I'm not going to ask you where you're from because I know that's probably a very triggering question, but you know, clearly you have a very interesting background and you've lived in many places. How do you engage through your poetry? And you really feel this in the book, especially with the artwork and the symbols that are integrated into it, and of course the multilingual quality to it. How do you engage with your heritage as you interpret that? I'm thinking particularly of Sudan, but I mean, whatever the heritage is that you feel you can draw on in a literary way.
I mean, I lived in Sudan for a while, and obviously I grew up with a lot of you know, of like Sudanese food, Sudanese culture, music, and you know, when you grow up with a culture but you're not in the actual space, it's very different than when you live there, because when you live there you move in, and I had a lot of really funny experiences of being in my country but not speaking in an accent that people recognized, or people thinking that I was from a different African country, or you know, feeling very out of place there. And I mean, otherness is a very big theme that I explore a lot in my writing, because it's something that I've lived with my entire life, in the sense that like you always like sometimes feel like you don't entirely subscribe to things in their entirety. You're just kind of in between places is where you feel comfortable. In my book, I try to pay homage to the Nubian Exodus, which is not spoken about enough, and which deals with also my ancestry and the fact that, you know, a lot of people were basically pushed out of their land and they had to move across and start over. And then now, as we see the events unfolding in Sudan, it's been kind of like a reverse exodus where people are leaving Sudan and going back to Egypt, and Egypt has capped the numbers, and there's been a lot of death. And it's actually quite heartbreaking and been very difficult to deal with, because it's, of course, you know, we're all heartbroken about everything that is occurring in Gaza and Palestine, but it's also amazing how little coverage of what the situation is in Sudan and the reality there in Sudan. For people who are wondering, like who to follow, there's a great she's an I don't know how to describe Sarah Hassan. She's just like one of my favorite people in the world. I'll start with that. But she's a person who's been following the political situation in Sudan, and she's on Instagram as BS on Blast. Her name is Sarah Hassan. Yeah, and she's an excellent person to follow to know all of the resources that are available to people who would like to reach out and support, people who have been displaced now. And it's also a very interesting and kind of weird feeling because like I've not been able to return for a very long time to Sudan because of my passport situation. And now that I can return, I can't return because it's like, and it's this idea also of like growing up in these like very kind of artificial American bubbles where you move from country to country and you're living the same, you move from, take your clothes off one shelf, get on a plane, get to a new place, put your clothes back on the same shelf in a different place. And also this idea of just moving constantly and not being able to go back to anywhere because these places are there for the time that they're there and then they're just kind of leaving. That's why there's a lot of nostalgia in my work and because it's a motif that has repeated itself for me for a very long time.
Yeah, you really get a sense of that in your writing, but you also get a sense that you use or maybe use is the right word, but you kind of make you make something very beautiful also out of this, like interlingual, I don't know if that's the right word for it, but there's this sort of very certainly multilingual kind of code switching quality, but you do things with that which I've never seen poets do. Like you mentioned before, like you would write a poem in English, but it's really kind of in Arabic, or it's drawing on Arabic styles. But there's some poems, there's one called arraigo, and I mean that word, oh gosh, I've also got not anywhere near the same level of complication, but yes, also a lifetime of not officially belonging anywhere and having to battle with bureaucracies to have papers and things like that. It's ongoing with my family, but arraigo in Spanish is, for anyone who doesn't know, it means rooting. And it used to be here that you could get what was called arraigo social, like if you'd been living in Spain for a number of years, you could, get residency through that. But there's a line in that poem where you say, I want to grab the alif of a word in Arabic and then use it as like a magic wand to create belonging. I mean, it's just I thought that was such a brilliant usage of that, like not just code switching to introduce a word from a different language which can't be translated, but like breaking the word up and envisaging the letters, because the alif is like a dagger. I mean, even that alif is described as a dagger in Arabic, I believe, as opposed to like an alif maksura. So I just thought that was so clever. I think there's a number of Muslim writers who, I mean, I'm kind of making the assumption that everybody is multilingual. That's obviously not the case, but many people are. But maybe they have been told or encouraged to not mix languages so much in poems. I've heard of people being told this in MFA programs, don't put that Arabic word in there because people won't understand it. And at the end of this book, you do have a glossary and you do, say what things mean. But what was your process in deciding to mix words, to mix languages in that way?
To be honest, it's just kind of the natural way that I go about writing and living. I mean, when I'm speaking, I'm always like switching between languages, whether it's in Spanish or English or Arabic or Greek or whatever language I'm mixing up. I also add, INGs to Arabic words and, all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But like, it wasn't really so much a conscious choice. It's just kind of the way that I think and write. But yeah, I do have to say that it's actually quite a struggle, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, I included the glossary in my book as a courtesy for people who didn't have access to those languages so that they could if they wanted, have like a close resource to be able to consult and know what is happening in the poem, and to not feel lost, because I understand that it can also alienate people people. But I also at the same time insisted on keeping the titles that I actually use like a little hieroglyphic, if you've seen, for the titles that are in foreign languages that people consult, because I feel like way too many like are used to everything being translated for them, and I feel like English readers also need to do the work, like in the sense that they um, can also feel what a person who doesn't know English experiences when they're reading, and the fact that like I don't know, I feel like we just cater to a world because English is such a dominant language that we have to everything has to be in English and it has to be broken down. And as I mentioned earlier, like there's just a lot of words that are missing in English that you just don't get, like I don't know, there's too many to mention right now, but I mean that was my main thing. And even though I know in the industry, like it's quite in the publishing industry, it's quite difficult with that because a lot of times also I've seen it people use for example languages in their writing where I feel like it can be also distracting. So it depends on how you use it. No, but I'm all for that. I think it's super important to step out of this space where like you have to explain or
I wanted to ask you also about how your experiences have been as a Muslim in the publishing industry.
I mean, to be honest, I've not had any experiences where people specifically have. It's been more about being African than being Muslim. To be honest, I haven't had any like direct because my work, I feel um, I think it's like it mixes so many different things. So I've never actually had any experience where anybody, for example, didn't publish a poem or had issues. I've had issues with spelling. I've had issues with people not respecting how I want to publish my work, like changing titles, people not respecting like the fact that or noticing the fact that like sometimes that I publish in lowercase letters and I'm not a big fan of uppercase. But as a Muslim writer, like I'm not really I mean, as a person who grew up in a Muslim also household, I feel like I don't know, Islam, as you know, is a faith that like we each interpret and live it in our own way. And I don't feel like anyone has zoned in on that, or has really specifically really. This is maybe the first time I've been asked, but yeah, I feel like my work has hints and hues, of my upbringing for sure.
Yeah. It's I mean it's up to everybody in a way to choose to what degree they want to incorporate their faith into their writing. It's not obligatory on anybody to talk about it even. And in a way, it's the very first interview that we had in this series was with Michael Sugich, and he said, let's not be provincial in our writing. We don't want to kind of paint ourselves into a corner and only talk about religion and only talk about faith or something like this, because we'll just end up with a very limited audience. And is that really what we want at the end of the day? Like, we could be writing fantasy sci-fi, we could be writing something completely different.
It's so true, Medina. And the thing is, it's also like, for example, I remember when I first started publishing, I really actually hated the fact that I ever had to put a photo out there. It was kind of my intention to never do that, but it was part of the Burnell rules, and I had to kind of come out with a photo. And I remember having the discussion with a fellow poet who lives in the city, who was like, "You shouldn't wear your turban because people are going to paint you as Orientalist, blah 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 blah." And I was like, that's my heritage. Like, I'm not going to. And like, I was like, how many people do you see in the publishing industry like wearing a turban? I mean, no, a few people, very few, no. And so I was like, no, I'm going to represent where I'm from, and I'm not going to change that, and maybe in aspects like that. But directly with like Islamic content, I've not really had a lot of people or interactions with people who paint the work as that. I think it's for a lot of people. In me, it's like the struggle of languages as well, like the Afro-Arab thing. For example, that a lot of people want to are like, you're Arab, and I'm like, I'm Swana. I'm not Arab. I speak Arabic, but I don't identify exactly as Arabic. I'm African. I identify as African, and like that's usually more of the controversy starts there more than anything else.
Yeah, and it's such a controversy, unfortunately, among Muslims, because so few Muslims recognize that actually part of the Swana region is, well, like half of that is Africa, you know, and Africa is the only Muslim majority continent, and yet very few people, even among Muslims, even recognize, like, there's so much anti-blackness in our communities as well.
Yeah, a lot of anti-blackness. That's actually kind of the project that I'm working on right now. Is I'm writing a book of essays about living in Spain, you know, as a person of color, and some of the wild experiences I've had from the get-go, and like arriving into Spain and experiencing and I've just kind of kept a journal, and I've kept like notes on different things that have occurred. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm working on right now.
Oh, that's really fascinating. I was going to ask you what your current projects are, and I'd love to read about that, because Spain, I have found to be very different. Obviously, as a white person, I filter the world differently. But I have noticed that Spanish people tend to be a lot more frank and blunt about their prejudices, and they'll just come out with things in a much more unfiltered way than Brits might, you know, who might be kind of more, they'll hold it in, perhaps they wouldn't express it, but I don't know. I don't know if you want to share any of that as a little sneak peek of your upcoming work.
I mean, I think that of course we can never like you know, paint a whole nation with as one thing. But I will say that I think the years that Spain, you know, has occurred with during Franco rule, I think it's put Spain way behind France and the UK when it comes to immigration and to Black presence. Like, I think as a person of color in at least in the city where I live in Granada, now it's great because I see there's a lot more people. But when I moved here in 2012, we were, I think, maybe 4 or 5 people in the city, and it was like every time you walked into a restaurant, every time you walked into a bank, like you just feel this, you know, a million eyes staring at you, all kinds of stupid questions, assumptions. And I mean, I know that I don't think it always comes from a place of malice. I don't think it's anything probably comparable to or nuanced as the US or the UK. But I do believe that there's still a lot of ignorance. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And yeah, and I hope that my book, actually, I'm writing it with hopes for, you know, people of color who are growing up in Spain, for them to have. I was really inspired by a book by Ruben Hernandez. I don't know if you've come across it. I highly recommend it. It's called Y tú porque eres negro, and why are you black? And it talks about him growing up in Spain as a black kid with no black role models. It's beautifully done. And so yeah, that book and Citizen by Claudia Rankine are my inspiration, you know, for it, for my book.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much for those recommendations. I love getting book recommendations from writers, because they're the people to, as you say, you've had an obsession with books all your life. So have we. And we always need more books. But I shouldn't say that, because I have far too many that are half open and not finished yet. I have one, possibly 2 or 3 more questions. If anybody else has any questions, please pop them in the chat, and I'll endeavor to keep an eye on that. How do you write a poem? Do you feel like something just arrives? What I felt with your writing is that it kind of reminded me a little bit of Ocean Vuong, the way that he uses words in.
That's a huge compliment. Thank you.
Well, it's deserved. It feels like that you're using language in a very novel way. I mean, obviously there's the multilingual quality of it. I wanted to point out as well, you made a pun between khiyar and ikhtiyar, and like that kind of thing. I just love puns, and like punning in different languages is next level. Like to make a pun between cucumbers and choice. I mean, boom. Like that was amazing, among many little of those kind of little nuggets. They're like little Easter eggs, I think, you know, when you come across them, you have to work a little bit to unpack it. But if you know the context, you know it already, it's like this little explosion of meaning. But even in the English, you're using it in ways that feels very novel. And I want to give a few examples, but I'd love to hear you actually read one or a couple of your favorite poems. There's lines like, why can a voice hijack so many passengers but never quietly land? It has this sort of delicious ambiguity. And I feel like that's just something I want. I know that's a very ambiguous thing to go into, but I feel that ambiguity is like this critical point that we need to grapple with, because like, especially people who are kind of people who live across margins, people who live across borders and boundaries, and who belong in many places, people who are multi-hyphenated, perhaps understand it better than somebody who's just been in one place all their life. Although, you know, my mum didn't leave America until she was 27, and she never felt like she belonged there either. But yeah, this idea of otherness as well, when you've been maybe forced to grapple with otherness all of your life, perhaps it gives you more to go on in that sense. And but this topic of ambiguity comes in and again in this really nice way, whereby we'll be reading a poem. Like there was one poem called Snake, and I read halfway through it, and then I was like, oh, now I get who he's talking to, and I kind of had to come back and start reading it again. And it gives this very multi-layered, like it gives depth perception, because things can be interpreted differently. And that seems like it should naturally be part of poetry, to have these different possible interpretations. And yet, you know, and this sounds very big, a big statement, but like civilizationally, we struggle with ambiguity. We struggle with people, like things potentially meaning two things at once, and, you know, living with that uncertainty and that difficulty, you know, and those differences. So this is a very ambiguous way into this. This isn't really a question at all, but I wondered if that was something that, you know, came into your poetry quite consciously or naturally. How you feel about ambiguity, basically.
I mean, it's a very curious word that you use, ambiguity. For me, like, I don't know. To me, it's very, maybe perhaps for the reader, it is ambiguous because there's enough space there for you, you know, your best friend and, you know, and their uncle or whatever. But like, for me, when I'm writing it, like, it's just really kind of my truth. Like, I don't, I don't feel like when I'm writing, like, I am like, and this is actually one of the reasons why I took out the last 10 poems, because I felt like sometimes I wasn't being clear enough in what I wanted to say or what I wanted to express. And that's like a whole other element, of course, to the kind of writing that I do, which has tinges of like confessionalism as well, and that like it speaks about your life, but in a way that, you know, that hopefully can other people can also see their own life, you know, that holds a mirror to other people's experiences. It's not so just about you, no. For example, the poem Snake, which you mentioned earlier, I wrote Snake about a relative that I met by accident in Greece, who had teenage children, and she was really, really thrilled to meet me and to make, you know, Sudanese food for me, because her kids, every time she'd make Sudanese food, would just go out and order like pizza, and they kind of like didn't really understand her. And to find somebody who could sit there and eat with her the food and chat with her in the same language, like it meant so much to her. And it's this also struggle of parents who migrate or, you know, immigrate to other places, and they're raising their children in a different context, in a different, you know, how to pass on your heritage and where you're from. And that's where that poem, for example, was. I was inspired by that, and I wrote that poem about that experience. So yeah, I think a lot of my writing is like just from observing life and people around me, like, and my own life, and reflecting on my own, you know, the work that I've had to do for myself, like in regards to so many different things. Like, I think when you're out of place, when you don't fit in a mold, when you are a person who, I don't know, just rubs people the wrong way, or doesn't have a filter, or, you know, you get painted as problematic, you get painted as a lot of different things. And in the end of the day, I think you have to learn to speak your truth in a way that is not, of course, you know, always trying to be gentle, but also truthful and, you know, and real. I think being real is like, this first book for me, I describe it as like ripping the band-aid off, because I think that there are a lot of things that are spoken about in that book, like For example, the poem "And," which is about a serious situation we have in Sudan, where still, where girls and kids in general are, because of honor killings and such, are dying, and this is still a reality. And so I have written about that, and I've also written about the kids who died and drowned, the girls who died and drowned, because of the fact that there weren't measures there that safeguarded their lives, and the realities of what happened in that place as well. Same as Letters That Drag, where they're Arabic letters, but at the same time they're also letters to people, like my friend who's mentioned there, Ruwaida, who passed in a hospital, like in a teaching hospital, from malaria. But it just, there was of course qadar, but mistakes happening there because there are no resources, or things are the way that they are in that place. So I know that the book, in a lot of senses, if you're a Sudanese person reading it, especially if you're a Sudanese person in the diaspora and you've moved to Sudan in as an adult or as a young adult, I think that they will be able to really understand where the book is coming from. I think people who are born and raised in Sudan also, and have left later on in life for whatever reason, can also see where the book comes from.
What's your process with a poem? Do you write and then edit numerous times? You give it like draw time? Is there any technique that you follow?
I generally write a poem. It's really weird. You asked earlier, like, how do I write a poem? But like, for me, like, a few things have to happen. Like I have to have a few kind of, no, I have to like brush against a few things, and then I'll be sitting down and they will come together in a poem. And it's very strange, the process. But when it comes to editing, I'm pretty meticulous. I write it, I edit it as soon as I'm done, I do like my first edit, and then I let it sit for a very long time. And then, for example, right now I'm working on also a second collection of poems. And like I've written a poem, like, I don't know, like last week, I think I wrote my last one, and edited it, and then looked at it again, and then made a few more changes. And then I'm like, okay, I'll look at this 6 months down the line. Like, I don't spend too much time with it because I really love editing. It's actually one of my favorite things in the world. So I love like editing other people's work, and I also love editing my own work. I love like this idea of like making it as compact as possible. And yeah.
Maybe we need to invite you back for a workshop on self-editing poetry, because it seems to be the bane of most writers' existence.
Oh, I love that. I love editing. Right now, as I mentioned earlier, my close friend Kat from Puerto Rico, she's here finishing her first novel, and yeah, and I just love sitting with her and like editing, and why did you put this comma here, and why is this important? Is this not important? And I love having that, the pleasure to look at words and play with words and change structure. For me, it's very exciting, that kind of work.
Wonderful. Does anybody in the audience want to ask any questions? You can pop them in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself. In the meantime, I'd love to ask you what I always ask writers. What kind of advice would you offer to particularly somebody who's just setting out, but maybe also for writers who are some way into their writing journey, but kind of feeling blocked, feeling stuck?
Okay, first of all, my first piece of advice that I would give is, when you decide to send your work out, it's super important to read the fine line, like to the fine print, as we would say, because there are a lot of places out there that like promote themselves as being diverse, open, blah blah blah, and at the end of the day, it's just all this, like, fortunately, a scam. So I would start by saying that it's really important, it's super important to look at where you're sending your work, and also to, if you can reach out to any of the writers who've published there, And I'm speaking about magazines. I'm speaking also about publishing houses, but especially um, when you get the courage to send your work out, it's important to send it out and to not hesitate, but to also make sure you're like where you're sending it, like have a look at the writers who are being published there as well, because I don't know, oftentimes I'll submit my work somewhere and then I'll just have a look at like previous published poets or writers. Very sadly, it's usually like zero representation from anywhere else. It's just like very white. So then I'm like, okay, I just threw away $15, but it's all good. So it's important to know, and I'm not saying just to send your work out to places that are BIPOC, but like I think it's important to know your audience, to know where you're sending your work, and yeah, I also think it's important that maybe people will argue with me about this, but I think it's really important to, if you write in a style, like it's important that people respect your style. Like, don't accept people saying, well, we'll only publish you if you change your spelling to British spelling. Now, that's nonsense. Like, it's 2024, and I disagree with people who try to force people to change their spelling. I find that really childish. And I think you have to like really make sure that whoever you're giving your work to, make sure that they're respecting your work and respecting your process and how you write. Like, just it's super important. I think the minute that you are pushover, like just things don't end well. That's my advice, and I'm not. And as for inspiration, I don't know. I get inspired by all kinds of crazy things. I love like different decks. Like some of them are just like there's this really nice deck. It's called the Values deck. I think you can get it on Amazon, and it talks about like honesty, different values. And sometimes when I'm like completely blocked or whatever, I'll go through this deck and I'll choose a few cards and I'll set them out on the table and sit with what these words mean and like try to put situations to the words, think of people, and then different kinds of writing come from that, like an elegy or a different kind of. So there's like lots of different things. I also sometimes like to go and like find old magazines or whatever, and or pick up like buy a few and do collages. Collage is one of my favorite things actually for writing. So like I just cut up stuff and like paste it together, and I'm like, okay, what is this talking? Why did I put all this stuff here? Like, what am I talking about? And then like but I haven't done that in a while. But I mean, I used to do that.
That's a
Also,
really cool writing prompt, actually. And then the poem can go with the piece of art.
yeah. Also, like I don't know, dictionary flipping, which is very old school, but I used to always do that.
I was going to say, I had to look up some words in English from your poems, including sillage, which is like the nicest word ever. And I had never how did I never come across this word? It means like the distance to which an aroma or a scent will reach. I'm like, oh, so good.
But yeah,
Did you find that in an old dictionary?
I'm a nerd. I'm a nerd. Yeah, no, I love words. I love language. So yeah, I also like, I don't know, I feel like it's important that when you're writing as well, that you introduce new language, new concepts, everything, but it's also super important that the message is getting through, the people who pick it up don't feel alienated. No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, we have a few questions. So Ambata says she's just thankful for the introduction to a new writer, to me, as in you're new to her, and would love to learn about editing poetry. I think we'd all love to learn about editing poetry and just ways to push our poetry a little bit further. I think that for me is where I get stuck, is that I'll write a poem and I'll be like, oh, I like this. And I'll be like, it could go somewhere else. It could go a little bit further. I could work with the way that the lines sit on the page, or there's something else to do. And then also like knowing when to stop, because like sometimes you can edit something too much and then you'd be like, I've lost what was fresh about it in the first place. Nora says, how did you overcome self-doubt to just put yourself out there? By the way, I'm buying your book, inshallah. The title speaks to me and Medina loves it. And she says, and where are you from? She also has a really interesting story.
I always, when people say where are you from, I say I'm from everywhere and nowhere. I really feel that way. I feel like right now I'm
Yeah,
from the
I can relate in a way. So yeah, how did you overcome self-doubt to put yourself out there?
I don't know. I think I'm still, this is gonna sound silly, but I think that we don't ever overcome it. I think we live with it on a daily basis. I don't, for me, it's really hard, even though I have now a published book. It's very hard to be like, I'm a poet. I feel I always like to say I write poetry rather than I'm a poet because poets to me personally are like Khalil Gibran, are like people who are still celebrated, like Yanis Ritsos, like I don't know, there's like these great I had a friend in France who used to call them the monstres sacrés, like the sacred monsters, and
Mm.
for me, like a poet is just it's a really big word, So um, I don't know. For me, I think I still doubt. Writing my first book, like one of the things that were I insisted, like I was telling myself, like this is like, this is getting you through the day. You're not going to be thinking about anything else. This is like a lifeline. This is there's got to be an element, there's got to be hope. And maybe I can demonstrate that by reading you a poem
Yes,
I
please.
wrote from the book. I'm gonna mail you out a new copy. I don't know what happened with
Oh, don't worry. I'll
Correos.
go check with the Correos, but it's nice. I've been reading the PDF. It's really nice. And something, I don't know, I'm very into symbols and I love how you've like woven a lot of symbols. It's like they've been sort of studied, like the whole book is kind of studied with symbols, and there's 99 pages in the PDF. And I don't know, I like to read things into everything. And I'm like, 99, I like that.
So I'm gonna read a poem called Wasiya, and Wasiya is something that's also very Wasiya is like in um, in Sudanese and also in Nubian culture. It's like a Wasiya for Ragaba, like people will touch like where your vocal cords are, like your little vocal box here, and they'll be like, Wasiya for Ragaba, like I entrust you with this, no, and keep it here, no, and Wasiya also, of course, in Arabic is like, the wasi hada is like you ask them for like a thing like I ask you, I entrust you with something, And I wrote this poem in a pretty dark place, but it has a few Arabic words in it, and also describes the beauty of Arabic to me. So I'm gonna read that one. How long is a life avoiding the beach, believing God spoke through my father, some found seashell pushed off a shelf I cannot bury? I'd like to think that there are aisles of men praying somewhere once I'm gone, that their tongues wrap around where I kept warm like a turban woven in prayer by strangers, that I am not found, stiff, half hanging off of a hotel bed under a phrase book in another useless language. I hope I go dreaming in Arabic because love there sounds like the wind passes through every vowel. Somewhere buried in my voice, there is asphalt singing as brothers build rooms for one another. I find new corners in case I come back. Everyone gets a dua to float across the lake and watch disappear. This is mine.
Mm. Wow, that's so beautiful.
Thank you.
And I like the structure of it as well. Like what's lost for people listening is the way that that's laid out on the page. It's like a prose poem, like justified all the way across the page with slashes. Is there anything you'd like to add about like why you chose to do it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I also really, I get really bored with like very traditional kind of like when I pick up a book. Of course, I grew up reading books that were, pretty straightforward, But I really love it when a page there's just space in a page. Like I'm a person who likes a lot of space in general. Like even in where I live, my apartment, I like this idea of being able to move, and I don't like this idea of like confining. And sometimes the poems that are, um, for example, in the beginning of the book, like breathing exercise, it echoes this idea of like, this like respiration, this kind of like, it's growing and kind of slowly you're taking deeper and deeper breaths. Also, like in the first year, where it's like a little bit scattered across in like different. I like to use the page in an unusual way, because I think also as a reader, it's quite nice on the eyes. Like your eyes aren't just stuck in one formation. And I think it's part of the imagination as well that you can do. That's one of the beauty. One of the things that I find most beautiful about poetry is that you can really do so much with it that you can't do in prose. So I like the spatial element of it, and the fact that obviously speaking Arabic and reading Arabic, and combining other languages, I think it just fits and works better. Like for the second collection I'm writing, I'm doing a lot of more um, like really crazy things with the spacing and texting, and like the way I use text in the book.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to that. Okay, we're going to squeeze in one more question, because I don't want to gobble up all of your Sunday evening. Andrew says, you mentioned English speakers need to do the work to broaden their linguistic horizons, and I completely agree. I'll second that. To what extent do you think this may highlight a colonial mindset?
Do I think? Okay. I think, of course, it is part of it. Is, I mean, I write primarily in English, so I mean, I'm not trying to say that English is not valid as a language or anything. I'm just saying that I do think it's probably, but we could say the same about French. We could say the same about Spanish.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think it's specifically with English, because I mean it's a language that is spoken all over the world, used in airports and whatever. It's a language a lot of people just expect to use as a practical language. You know, and I think that needs to be broken. I think people need to, and I think in some places where there's more diversity, I think that it's already happening with the kids that are growing up today, and you can see it in just in their lingo, the way that they speak with one another, and they have a different mindset. No, but I think that for your typical reader, it's not very common. I mean, you'll come across, obviously nowadays more and more writers are doing this. But I think it's important to also, when a word has no English equivalent, to use the word.
I agree, and that's the other thing to say is that, like, I mean, in terms of reach, it's like this tension, isn't it? It's like between wanting to reach as many people as possible, because I feel like that's kind of the fundamental desire of a writer or an artist, is like, I mean, unless you just do it entirely for yourself and lock it all away, it's that thing of crossing the threshold and taking your art, which comes from your heart and soul, and present it to other people, and for it to be able to reach as many people as possible. But then the fact that the biggest languages in the world have been forced upon so many people. I mean, even Arabic has been forced upon Sudan. It's been forced upon many places. But it is interesting also to think that like in parts of London and Paris, like now people say Bismillah, mashallah, like that's become part of their lingua, that lingo.
Yeah.
And even things like Korean, people are really into Korean music, like
culture is, I mean, super important, and it's such a gateway, I think, into broadening our perspectives. And I think, of course, poetry is super important in that sense as well, because it's breaking and it's breaking boundaries, in the sense that, like, right now in the world, people who are not really into poetry may not know this, but it's such a powerful moment for poetry, I think, especially in the US, the UK as well, and all over the world. But like a lot of work by what people like to call marginalized or underrepresented writers, people who have a lot to say, and a lot of beautiful writing, a lot of great Muslim writers. I don't know. I can recommend a few more if you wanted.
oh yeah, that'd be
cool. Yeah, a great Muslim writer that I'm not sure if I have the book. I love Marwa Hilal, who's a wonderful. She's an Egyptian American writer. She's one of my favorites. Yeah, she's a great writer. And also Solmaz Sharif, who also is one of my biggest inspirations when it comes to creativity and on the space and how to use languages. Thuraya al-Muntasir has a beautiful book called The Wild Fox of Yemen, which I highly recommend. Yeah.
And also, what journals would you recommend? Going back to the question of, thinking carefully about who to apply to and who to send it, submit your work to. Are there any that you particularly like to read?
I love Mizna, for example. I think Mizna is a wonderful publication. I highly recommend to send work there. Also, the Michigan Quarterly Review is one of my favorites. The African American Review is wonderful as well. The International Poetry Review is great as well. I recently had two pieces featured in an issue about revolution and the Arab world. And yeah, I can give, I'm more than happy to give you a list of some recommended reading if you would like that as well.
That would be amazing. We actually have on the platform, for those who are members, in resources, we have a list of journals that are either specifically focused, like for example Mizna, specifically focused on Muslim or Swana or South Asian or areas that are of interest to Muslims, or publishers also that are of interest. But we can always add more. I mean, it's in theory all of them should be of interest, but we know that some of them are perhaps a little bit more.
Yeah, more receptive. And I think also it's the fact of just trial and error. I remember the first place I got published in, and it was a really I don't remember even sending the work out there, but I had one of the poems that ended up actually in my book called Forgiveness, published in a very interesting magazine called Peking Cat magazine. Peking Cat magazine.
Peking Cat.
Yeah, Peking Cat. And I have no idea when I sent that. I don't have any memory of actually sending my work there, but it got published and they were kind enough to send me a contributor copy. And so I think as you start sending your work out more and more, I think you kind of develop, an eye for the kind of places that are suitable to your writing, your style, and what you're doing. Actually, Mandina, I wanted to share a poem that I wrote recently because it explains maybe a little bit about the process and about what I was mentioning. And it's a poem that I wrote called Shapeshifter. And I also want to mention that I really enjoyed reading your collection of poems, Medina. I thought it was really clever, and the way that you also use language was really surprising and very refreshing to read.
Thank you. Oh, that's very nice to hear from you.
I really hope that the people who are tuned in, especially those who are not maybe regulars, that they have access also to your collection. It's quite beautiful, the one that you've sent. I've been really lucky also to have people like Shireen here, as you know, in the city. We always have really interesting and deep conversations about, faith and about how you walk in your faith. And
yeah,
she's a great one.
I think that's kind of the topic of topics for us in a way. It's like, how to represent faith in a way that isn't too well, it's just different and fresh and but at the same time authentic. Oh, please read. Well, this is new. Oh, how exciting.
This is a new poem that I still haven't put out there, but I did want to read it because I felt it would give you a little bit of idea about how it's about shape-shifting. It's about also the fact that I think we all do this in our lives, is that we change and we are put in situations where we have to, as we mentioned earlier, kind of code switch and constantly change and shift in order to survive, And so this poem I wrote, and I think you'll see that I wrote it after I actually wrote it in a really noisy place, which is where I do my best writing. And yeah, I wrote it about the situation that is happening right now in the world and in Gaza specifically, but also kind of in a circular way. Like it starts with my childhood, my life, my experiences, and circles back into what's happening today. So yeah, I'll read this one to you. They call my heartbeat irregular, and I smile. Know too well that little boy on a swing set fluttering in my chest, mouth crammed with sweets during Ramadan, hiding from shadows in the grass. It's just his head tilting whenever it skips, admiring the clouds, pretending he could be one. What no one ever teaches children is that sometimes simply wishing becomes a dangerous act. One afternoon, you're dragged to the first row to pray at the mosque, where there's never really room for you. So you disrobe your fears, become a place of worship, where only birds visit daily to show disrespect. Finally, you decide to join them, falling behind migration until no one remembers. Soon enough, you are returning deep into the folds of the earth as a fruit tree, cursing legions of ungrateful visitors who carry your fruit away. Years of this, hoarding as they dismember the shade and memory of your body for warmth. Part of you escapes the smoke, others shipped and sold, steeped and floating survive in teacups and conversations. Now you are the courage coating the throats of a population in villages and cities you can't pronounce. Disguised as the water of tears, you are that invisible dampness, trapped in corridors, weaving shrouds at a loom for every last drop of shamelessness. I am there with you, watching the exodus of children, queuing at sunset to become the clouds that will always take our breath away.
Wow. Gosh, the exodus of children. It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, to go back to the ambiguity point that I brought up earlier, like things can mean different things. I don't mean that to mean that things are lacking in meaning, but that they can have very solid meanings, you know, and one very solid meaning. And here's another very solid meaning too. But here, this meaning is so strong, particularly when framed in that way, you know, the exodus of children, queuing at sunset to become the clouds that will always take our breath away. It's a breathtaking poem, actually. Well done, mashallah.
Thank you, Shukran.
Really, it's such a pleasure and a real honor to speak with you about your poetry and how you come to write poems, especially because it really feels like we can gain so much inspiration from hearing from people like you. You know, like I got halfway through reading your book and I felt inspired to write a poem myself because that's how really good work, you know, operates. It'll prompt more. It'll sort of open a door for you. It'll lay out the red carpet like, here you go, off you go now. Here's this beautiful creativity and here's this new way of looking at the world. And you can do it as well. It's really extraordinary. Thank you so much. Well, I think we should wrap up here because I don't think we can improve upon those last lines.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Medina, for your time, and to everyone who's watching. I appreciate you being here. And shukran.
Allah yabarak fik. It's been really, really wonderful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Medina. And inshallah, in the future, if you have any kind of events that deal with poetry or editing of poetry, please do
Yes,
let me.
it would be a joy to invite you. But we are going to meet up and just have a coffee as well.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Take care, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.